I'll let Allison introduce herself again.
Yeah, I am Allison Norrie. I'm a social studies teacher, high school social studies teacher at Fairfield Ward High School in Fairfield, Connecticut. And for the sake of, you're about to get inundated over the next hour and a half with information, so these slides might be a little sparse, but that's for your own protection and well-being. I'm particularly focused, obviously, given my background in the 7 through 12 classroom. I also spent over 10 years working in museums as well, and so material culture, visual culture, access to archives, which Kim, I might ask you to talk a little bit about, very essential in, one, teaching the Holocaust, teaching genocide, two, using the C3 frameworks in an inquiry-based setting to try and get students to discover some of their own things about genocides, maybe even genocides, or not termed genocides, but human rights violations that are taking place in 2017, 2018, 2019, into the future. I'm referring more specifically to what's going on in Myanmar. If anybody's interested too, and you probably already know about this, just as an aside, PBS Frontline documentaries are all free and available with resources, and there's a lot of good, the production value is really great. There's a lot of really good stuff on the Frontline webpage if you ever want to show your students little clips or snippets that are, dare I say it, somewhat unbiased in this world of alternative facts, right, and fake news. This is becoming problematic with some of my students and trying to get them to validate sources and figure out what's reliable and what's not. I also want to mention too, we're only here till 12:30 today, but David Pettigrew was kind enough to get us additional breakout space, so if anybody did want to stay, develop lessons, go through some of the materials that we in Fairfield have developed, we're all happy to stay and work with you guys afterwards if that's of interest to anybody. We can give you all that information at 12:30 as to where those breakout rooms are going to be. A couple of things, and then I want to get you guys talking because I think that's going to be more important. Some key elements in developing, even if you only have a day, a lesson or a unit in the 7 through 12 classroom. This doesn't so much apply to elementary school, though bits of it might. David did a great job of defining terms. That is going to be a key component in developing your lessons and also giving students some direction as to where they're going. What is a Holocaust? What is the Holocaust? What is a genocide? And then leading into a really well-structured, well-thought-out, compelling, or essential question. And this is something that could guide an entire, not just unit, but an entire year of inquiry-based learning. For example, a question like, if I teach both American and global history, but what are the responsibilities of a global citizen, right? And that's something that you can carry with you, or the students can carry with them throughout the year. And are we responding, for example, if that is your question, as Americans to crises in places like Myanmar? Did we do all that we could during the Holocaust to prevent these crises from happening in the 1930s and 1940s? Another essential component, and the frameworks are really helpful for this, but you don't need them. You're probably doing this in your classrooms. Making sure that students understand when they're using primary and secondary source documents, what they're working with, how to find bias in some of these documents. I know at the high school level, most of my students, when we get to World War II or we do any human rights units that involve more modern genocides, their primary experience with the material of the Holocaust, for example, comes from a language arts background, comes from a language arts classroom in the middle school. It's usually something like night, which is great, but their foundation is a literary one, not a scientific one, right? Which is one of the reasons the legislation really emphasizes the social studies classroom is that this isn't interpretation, this isn't fiction, these are real events that are happening, and here's how we're going to analyze them. So their source material, in other words, that they might have reference to in a 9 through 12 classroom would be literature. And is literature an unbiased source? I mean, you could debate that, right? So students need to have those skills. And then, of course, providing a wide variety of source material. We are lucky enough today to have a bunch of people who provide that material for us, whether it's the ADL or the state of Connecticut. And I encourage you all to reach out and talk to all these guys, even if it's in our breakout sessions, if you guys want to potentially join. The Greenberg Center does really great work. We've taken students up there as well to the museum at UHart. I highly recommend going if you haven't. It's a really great local resource, and it's free, which is also nice. There are still survivors. There are survivor networks left in the state of Connecticut for Holocaust survivors. But given that we're getting further and further away from the Holocaust, and I have students who are unaware of certain things, or who have written me essays for midterms about how Hitler built good roads, so maybe he deserves to be vindicated, right? Not having that context is rather challenging, and so I think that's what we're seeking to do. I will say one more thing before I start asking you guys some questions or to share. We tend to, in Fairfield, and however you want to do it, this becomes really helpful for teaching genocide and genocide studies. We frame everything within the kind of meta-narrative of human rights. And so it allows us a lot of flexibility, allows the students a lot of flexibility when doing research, but also from a curriculum standpoint, with being able to study different types of genocides, because there are a lot of them. And that's one of the challenges that at least I face in the classroom is, how do I feel responsible. How do I hit every single one of these? I can't. But in a student-centered learning environment with a human rights angle, they can. And so there's a lot of strategies that, if you were willing to stay later, we could always develop as a group. But I'd be curious to know, how many of you teach the Holocaust? Quick show of hands. So some of you are teaching it. How many of you just teach genocide in general, in addition to the Holocaust? Okay, so not as many of you. I'd be curious to know, what are some strategies that you use in your classroom with students, some resource material, et cetera, that you found valuable in teaching over the years? Does anybody want to get the ball rolling? Yeah.
Primary source survivor details through echoes and reflections, and they have great stuff on that.
Mm-hmm.
The political cartoons that were used as propaganda in Europe and in Germany at that time.
Do you find that the propaganda is effective, the visual stuff is effective with the students, or the?
Yeah, it is. I mean, allow them to interpret it, at first before kind of talking about or discussing what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I teach at the intermediate school level, so I think it. I don't know where to switch this.
It's on.
It's on. Okay. So to allow them to relate to a cartoon,
Mm-hmm.
kind of brings them into their time right now.
Does anybody ever pair propaganda? Do you ever pair propaganda with newer stuff or newer political cartoons?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what we have to be connected to today.
Yeah.
Pretty much, politically.
And is everybody on an email list for this event? You guys know? Because I encourage you all too, if there's any specific resources that you find valuable that you're using in your classroom, just CC everybody on an email. Because it's just, there's so much, there's just such a plethora of stuff out there. It could be beneficial to, if you have any particular cartoons you use or anything like that, to share. Any other strategies that you're using in the classroom? Anybody in the middle school? How do you tackle this in the middle school?
It really, again, focusing on, to begin with, defining the terms to them and explaining what it is. I mean, they've never heard of it before. And then the way I do it is we talk about what happened at the end, and we talk about the numbers. And then my job, and I tell them this, is we're going to start at the beginning to see how do you get to that number. It doesn't just happen with, as we said before, one single event, like one single year or something. And as we go through it, they then start to understand how something like this happens. And, I keep tying it into today and how the responsibility of a global citizen, what's your job when you see things, because in the beginning, when you talk about in the early 30s, there are things that, and that's the stuff that really gets to them, because they say, well, why doesn't someone say something? And it gets to a really good discussion. And so when you do get to the end where it gets hard, they're more prepared for that,
Mm-hmm.
and they're more willing to, and they understand why you got to that spot and how it got there, as opposed to just starting right away. And I think that's the best way to, it seems for me the most effective way to do it with them, because they are younger.
Yeah.
And it gets, I use a lot of the testimony from Echoes and Reflections, and that's something they identify with. I ask them all the time, you know, what do you like, what do you like most, you know, what really got to you? And a lot of the times, because they're following the same people through each step, and they're identifying with them, you know, because a lot of them, the testimony is from people who were their age at the time. So that's what seems to work best.
So a lot of primary source material.
I'm not a teacher per se teaching this, but I find that teaching the Holocaust, but also there's another side to it. One of the sides is the the righteous Gentiles, which is so important to show the students that there were people there who did help. There's a wonderful video by students who wanted to know what 6 million looked like. So what did they do? I don't know if you know about this video. They collected paper clips. And the video is called Paper Clips. And it shows people sending paper clips to the students, and in turn it went to Israel. And it's housed, those 6 million paper clips is housed in Israel. There are some very wonderful women out there. One of them is called Irina Sandler, who was a social worker and took children out of the ghetto. There's a movie about her. There are a couple of things there. She died at the age, I think it was 96. Another one is right here in New Haven. There's a man called Mr. Pritchard, and his wife is called Marianne Pritchard. If you look it up online, she was from the Netherlands, and how she saved just a few Jews. So from teaching them such difficult subjects as so much murder, put the good side as well.
It's a great point. And that's one of the useful things too about having students doing research. I mean, obviously you're curating the source material, the testimonies are great that the ADL has. It gives students that opportunity to be able to establish more complex relationships with history, right? It wasn't just 6 million dead people. There were efforts made by other individuals. Yeah. There were efforts made by other individuals. Can you hear me without this?
Yeah, but we're recording.
Oh, sorry. There were efforts made by other individuals to be effective and good citizens of the world. And what do those questions look like in a contemporary setting? Does anybody teach civics? Oh, yeah.
Well, I really like.
Thank you. I really like the way you have that broken out, because what the students really need to do is they need to get some background before you guys can move forward to do anything. And a big part of that is defining the terms, what it is that they're talking about. And what I would suggest looking at is a book that's called The Holocaust and Other Genocides. It's an introduction by Maria Van Haperen, Weikert Ten Hav, Ben Kiernan, and a number of others. And it's a compilation that addresses a number of genocides, certainly not all, but I think it may start with the Herero, 20th century genocides. And it does exactly that. It gives the student the background that they need, and it gives you an opportunity to, it'll give them the background, it'll give them the terminology, and then you guys can work from there and take your lessons in any direction that you choose. But they did a good job of breaking it out, so it might save some time.
Would you mind repeating that title for anybody who didn't catch it?
Sure.
Thanks.
The title's called The Holocaust and Other Genocides, an introduction by Maria Ten Haperen, Weikert Ten Hav, and Ben Kiernan. And there's a number of others that have contributed to that work.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Yep. Ben Kiernan was the founder of the Genocide Studies program. That reference will obviously be on our the website.
Yes. Yeah.
One of the resources I like to use in my room is there's an interactive constitution through the National Constitution Center, and they have the Constitution, but they also have rights across the world where you click on it, you can apply. The kids have some knowledge. I teach mostly seniors in human rights.
Sure.
They have some knowledge of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And then you can click on any of the amendments and you can see other countries and what they have written about freedom of speech in their own constitution. So kids can actually see how it's worded, what kind of rights they think their citizens are entitled to. And it really helped last year when we talked about it. I know you used Myanmar as an example here. It really helped them understand the situation when they heard the government there was denying that the people were citizens. So it exempted them from those rights. Kind of helped approach the subject in that area.
Thank you. Yeah, very useful. David?
I was motivated to make a quick comment about the packet of information that we provided for you today when you came in. There's a handout with primary source material on Varian Fry. Varian Fry was lived in Connecticut for 20 years and he died in Richfield. And he was the first American to be named or recognized as righteous among the nations. He's virtually unknown. There's no memorial for Varian Fry in the state of Connecticut. But I provided you with some reading materials. He was in Berlin in 1935 and witnessed the pogrom and wrote about it for the New York Times. And sometimes we wonder, what did we know? And when did we know it? So this was in the New York Times in 1935. He returned to Marseille, returned to Europe and went to Marseille in 1940-41 and ran an operation that saved over 2,000 Jewish refugees, including Marc Chagall, Hannah Arendt, Max Ernst, and Marc Chagall, Jacques Lipschitz, and so forth. But so this is something I wanted you to have because it might help in a classroom in the state of Connecticut to talk about one of our own local heroes. There's also, I put in a copy of his of the certificate in him righteous among the nations, and then an article that's very interesting he wrote in 1942 when he came back for the New Republic that outlines the Holocaust that was in progress and pleading with President Roosevelt or the American administration to loosen its immigration policies. So that's, I mean, the other piece that I provided you with, which I'll talk about later, is a speech by Hitler in October 1943, the Posen speech, in which he uses terminology dehumanizing the Jews and justifying the extermination. So that, I just thought it was a good point to let you know about the packet about Varian Fry.
Yeah, and David, that's a good thing you bring up too about historical memory and how do we remember heroes, local heroes with no monuments in this case. I'd be curious to know too, anybody in the room, do you broach the subject of, and I think about the alternative fact thing a little bit too, Holocaust deniers? I mean, there's been some legislation in Poland, there's a lot going on internationally vis-a-vis denying certain genocides have happened, specifically the Holocaust. I mean, has that ever come up in anybody's classroom? Is that an issue with students? Yeah.
I asked that at the beginning of every ECHOS program.
Yeah.
How many of you as teachers have had at least one student make statements that lead us to believe that they're Holocaust deniers? And the number of teachers who say yes is very high. I've had some classrooms that every teacher raised their hand.
That's unbelievable. What advice or any kind of,
So
yeah,
one of the many creative, I guess, curricular materials that I've received from teachers after taking ECHOS was from a teacher in West Hartford who developed a whole piece where he had his students write letters to Holocaust deniers. So based on everything he was teaching in his classroom, he then asked the students to apply that and write letters to Holocaust deniers. And I have those and I use that as an example of something teachers can do, because that really is applied knowledge and it's practical, because you may have a class as a student where one of the other students says something, and then you'll be prepared to be able to respond.
Yeah.
So putting a spotlight on Holocaust, no matter where it comes from and why. And it's not just young people, because we're talking to teachers who will talk about young people. Where is that coming from? Where are they hearing about it? Why are they hearing about it? And how to respond effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, we do a relatively large amount of work with, not even so much Holocaust denying, where I am at Fairfield Board, but a lot of it is white supremacy and recruitment techniques in the United States for US history teachers, but we also do a section of it in our global classes as well. And it proves pretty useful in kind of getting ahead of the curve and anticipating that there might be students who aren't maybe Holocaust deniers, but who might have unobjective opinions about or ideas about things like the Holocaust or other genocides that have taken place. The New Yorker, too, I don't know if anybody saw this, published an article very recently referring to the partition of India in the late 40s as a genocide. Did anybody read this? It's I think it was a couple days ago they published this. It's recent. I just happened upon it the other day. And I'd also be curious to know, are your students with terminology in particular, did they look at things in the news media ever and say, well, why aren't people calling something a genocide? I mean, I'm thinking Myanmar, but also with the India partition thing, it got me thinking, because to use the word is kind of a big deal, right? Once you start, you're a mainstream news organization that throws that word out there, that's kind of big.
Maybe just talk about the middle school piece, but I think we're...
No, please, no, we're dial it back, yeah.
You know, to your point about, Holocaust denial and all of those pieces and kind of navigating that in the classroom, I think it makes a really good case for kind of the disciplinary literacy piece with our students and really working with kids on thinking like a historian. How would a historian, how would a political scientist go about determining that what this argument is, and if it has any truth. And so I think that's kind of an important piece of the work that we do with our students. They're so young, and they're still learning how to kind of interact with text and interact with all of these things in the world, and even more so now they have lots of things coming to their newsfeed that are curated in really interesting ways for them, and based on what they click on a given day, things are popping up, and so the information is coming to them, and I think we just have to do more work from like a discipline-specific focus with those students. So one of the things that we've done with middle schoolers, because we do have students reunite in 8th grade in Westport, and the social studies teachers often, they will work with those teachers and teach the Holocaust. They will also do some case study work with genocides that have taken place since the Holocaust. One of the things that we found to be really engaging for students is that we have done human rights book clubs, so we've explored the Declaration of Human Rights with them as a document and kind of looked at some of those case studies and then taken kind of a broader look at human rights, and how we've had students choose books, and they be in book clubs not necessarily based on the book that they're reading, but based on themes that they've identified. Right. And so we look at it in a broader sense of like, how do we kind of get to some of these places? How do we arrive at a moment where we see genocide taking place, but then where are the other moments of man's inhumanity to man? And we find that often for middle schoolers gives them a way in to start to understand all of these different ways that people around the world are unkind to one another, at the kind of most basic level, and then how do we arrive at these mass atrocities and genocide, and what is our role as citizens of the world. So we found that letting them choose texts that are appropriate and engaging for them, that they really kind of get involved, and they have something that they're passionate about, and they can kind of take them to think about those issues in bigger ways.
Yeah, that's what's so cool about being in the middle school is that you're set up to collaborate with English teachers or LA people who might already be teaching a Holocaust book. And at the high school level, that's something, if you're not teaching the Holocaust and you know that the English people are, that's a really, like a human rights book club is a really great opportunity at the high school level to, if you were interested, broach the spirit of collaboration and try to collaborate with different departments, yeah.
You know, as difficult as it may be to address, I'll try and do this without the microphone. As difficult as it might be to address Holocaust denial, I think that we have to come to grips with the reality that it's going to continue to exist. So we either embrace it or we find ourselves getting into difficulty. So I think that as we embrace it, it gives us an opportunity to talk about how do we view this denial, and should we shut it down? And it gives us an opportunity to segue into other things. For example, in some countries, Holocaust denial speech is prohibited, it is outlawed, and is prosecuted. So, but it's not prosecuted in the United States and Canada and elsewhere. So what do? Do we say we should shut down this speech? And what do we do when we shut down that speech? And all the consequences of shutting down speech. And so I think that it's an opportunity to talk about that and to segue into, if you're dealing obviously with the Holocaust, to segue into how the Nazis came to being and what they did once they came to power. And it gives you an opportunity to segue that, as opposed to saying, no, they're bad, they're wrong, because that gets us into difficulty and it sends the wrong message to the student.
Yeah, providing a degree of intellectual humility in a classroom and creating that comfort zone to be able to discuss stuff like that generally is very beneficial in shutting stuff down without ignoring it. Because I think that's a default that a lot of us do, and I know I'm tempted to just ignore it without having a discussion if I hear it. And is that the right answer? In a classroom, probably not, right? Yeah.
Well, actually, one of the ways I try to segue, I know you were talking about how you get to that number 6 million. One of the ways, there's a great quote by Dwight Eisenhower when he talks about why he visited, and he actually shows the ability to think ahead and say, you know, one day I went intentionally because one day I knew that people would deny that this ever took place. And it kind of puts them in the place of being a historian, because they're taking witnesses, they're taking films and pictures, and Eisenhower and other people were taking that evidence because they knew ahead of time someone's at one point going to say this doesn't happen. And it's, for me, a way to transition when you start talking about death camps, to make sure the kids, we're not just talking about this because there's a dark fascination with how these people were killed, because sometimes there is that. The kids start to focus on, well, how did they kill different people? What are the different ways? And that's not really the focus. The focus is how you get to that point, and this is the end game that happens when you deny someone else's humanity.
Yeah, that's a great quote too, the Eisenhower quote you're referring to. It's an excellent way to start a unit. I mean, you could start a unit with just the quote and have students kind of unpack it, which is really useful. And we'll take a break in just a minute. I did want to leave you with one lesson. Somebody else need the microphone? Yeah.
Wow.
You should just start tossing it.
A lot of really good ideas. One of the more practical things in the classroom that I found is helpful is from the ADL is the pyramid of hate.
Yeah.
So that, talking about the process of what genocide is, I found in a lot of the classrooms, in a lot of the classrooms that I go into, a lot of our teachers use that as a way to start with the Holocaust and then branch off into other genocides. So using that same process.
It's super effective, yeah, and when you pair it too with like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, they work really nicely together as like a package, especially if you're working with limited time in the classroom. It's a good combo. The pyramid of hate is fantastic, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, how do the students get affected by listening to the Holocaust Do they cry? Do the girls cry about stories that are told? Are the boys very upset about it? I mean, what's going on in our community now with all this opioid and all the killings of people, how do they relate the Holocaust to our everyday life?
There have been a lot of different emotions. I've seen kids cry, but for the most part, they're quiet about it. I mean, you have to bring them into it and then eventually bring them out of it. You know, but it's there have been a wide, there are a lot of different emotions. Very rarely do you find somebody who is, and I teach, you know, that's 8th grade, and we teach it in traditionally. Very rarely do you find kids that are inappropriate with it. It kind of amazes me at times because there's a lot of inappropriate behavior in 7th and 8th grade. But with this topic, it's usually very limited. Very.
I'd say too, at the end of the year, I always ask my students, just what was your favorite unit or unit you found most interesting? And 95%, every year, and every time I ask this question, around 90 to 95% of the students, it's the unit on genocide and the Holocaust. It's not because they like it, they didn't know, and they had no idea, and they've taken that ideas of, you know, what they need to do, and, you know, how they need to make sure that other people don't forget, and the lessons of in the world they live in today, and they take that with them. And I always find that fascinating, that it's the same every time I ask that question. That's the one that stuck out to them.
It's always the unit, the genocide unit that we do, or the Holocaust stuff as part of World War II, where students understand that you can feel history. There's something about it where they actually are able to put emotion for the first time into historical analysis and perspective. And there's a level of excitement about that. That comes with it. It's not that they like the Holocaust, but it's that they feel something, and that's meaningful. So awesome, guys. It's almost 10:30, so we're gonna break so you can eat, get some coffee, carry on these conversations, and then when we pick back up, you're gonna get downloaded with a bunch of really great content. So thank you all very much for sharing.